As someone who primarily makes instrumental music of the ambient, modern classical persuasion, one of the most common DMs that I get is, "Hey, this is a cool track, can I put a beat to this?" Fire emoji, fire emoji, fire emoji. And some of my music does indeed have unpitched percussion loops and drum machines and samples that I've placed strategically in a very rhythmic manner. We'll just call them beats. But not everything needs a beat. And if that's our default go-to every time we try to add some energy and interest into our tracks, maybe we could benefit from exploring some other ways to do that. That way we aren't always falling back on the same devices every single time, because for me, that's when I get a little restless and a little unsatisfied, because I know I'm just going back to my same old bag of tricks. One of the simplest, easiest, quickest ways to add interest, rhythmic interest specifically, to a track with no beats is through texture arrangement, sound design. And this can be as simple as a slow evolving drone, which we've talked about on this channel in the past. You could even gate that in some sort of rhythmically interesting way if you wanted to interject more energy into it. Or it could be as intricate as chopping up a bunch of samples that you've recorded and dropping them into something like Ableton's drum rack and then playing them rhythmically. So you're treating it almost like a texture kit, which is something that I love to do in my own music. And when I use this technique myself, I like to keep the samples mono or fairly dry, or at least with the effects baked into the samples themselves, so that I can pan them around and create the kind of separation that I like to hear in a mix, even an ambient mix. It may be unexpected, but it really helps those textures to pop out and to provide that rhythmic interest that we're looking for. Some people call this ear candy, but that kind of indicates that it's a bit of an afterthought, and it can be used that way to just accent what you already have. But it can also be the foundation of a track. It just depends on how you use it. This is one of the things that I love about modular synthesis in particular, is I discover these weird patterns, weird sequences, all of these weird rhythmic things that I would never come up with on my own, and then I can do interesting things, be inspired to do things that I would never do without that. Everything that is not unpitched percussion is impacted by harmony. We usually jump straight to thinking about chord progressions when we talk about harmony, but it directly impacts our melody writing as well. Melodies are linear harmony. It also directly impacts our arrangements and the way that they fit together through harmonic consistency and contrast. One of the most common things that I hear from producers and composers is that they feel their progressions and melodies are too cliche and predictable. But when they try to force them to not feel that way, they feel, well, forced. But having just one fresh chord, as my composition teacher used to call it, within a chord progression can help divert the listener's expectations, and if we're careful with our selection, it can feel inevitable rather than predictable. It can also impact the entire mood of a piece or a track by just changing the harmonic rhythm, which is just a fancy way of saying how fast, how quickly the chords change. So this feels very different than this. And I haven't changed the melody at all, it's just changing the harmonic rhythm. how the chords change underneath the melody. If you want to know more details about specific harmony techniques that I love to use, you can download a free ebook. It'll be the first link in the description below. I've also made a playlist of videos talking more about this that I'll leave in the end screen. Melodies are hard to write. I think that's why they've kind of fallen out of fashion. It's so easy for a melody to fall into this sort of cliche territory. And then when we try to make them more interesting, we end up overcomplicating them and they lose what makes them memorable or special in the first place. My two primary rules for melody writing are they have to be singable, or at least playable. If you're just entering MIDI notes on a grid into a sequencer or something, it is so easy to create something that is inherently unmusical. And what I mean by that is no one would ever play that on an instrument. If you have a physical connection with a melody, your limitations force you to make certain choices. You have to choose notes more carefully, and instead of just always defaulting to adding more stuff, you have to consider very carefully, what could I leave out to make this more accessible? And that's an incredibly important and effective question to always ask. Things feel more human when they are playable by humans. Just because the technology allows you to do something, it doesn't mean it's always the most musical thing if that's what you're going for. Melodies also have to be memorable, and this can be achieved through the use of some kind of structure, pattern, contrast, this sort of dialogue that a melody can have, where there's a question, there's an answer. Rhythm exists in every kind of music. Even slow ambient drone has rhythm, it's just incredibly slow most of the time. Rhythm, at its core, is just the systematic arrangement of musical sounds. And these can be highly transient sounds, which we would call a beat, and they can also be not very transient sounds, which we might not think of as rhythmic at all. We could take something like Samuel Barber's famous piece, Adagio for Strings, as an example. It definitely has rhythm. The parts align at certain specific predetermined times that create the harmonies underneath. This is what I talk about when I say think linearly instead of vertically. So rather than thinking about chords, Barber is thinking about individual lines, and the way that those lines line up with each other at certain specific times, rhythmically, determines the chord, determines the harmony underneath. It has multiple parts that interact with each other almost like a conversation, and that makes it more memorable to us as humans because that's how we communicate with one another. So that's a great way to think about music, is conversationally. It comes naturally to us, and it's immediately relatable to us. It's why we use terms like call and response or question and answer when we're talking about musical phrases. And as I mentioned earlier, we can use texture and sound design in this way as well, where it's conversational. Things are rhythmically responding to other things. One specific production technique that I enjoy using is influencing other elements, texture elements, with beats, but then muting the beats themselves. For example, I don't really like hi-hats in my music, but I will use sidechaining and gating from other elements to influence the tape hiss from a tape loop or something and create a similar effect. But it, to me, is more interesting because it has all of those texture elements that we wouldn't really associate with just a traditional hi-hat. So just spend a little time thinking about non-obvious ways that you can implement rhythmic elements in your music that aren't always the default standard go-tos that you reach for every time. I think when we avoid just reaching for the most obvious solution, you know, that 808 kick and snare that you've used a million times, we find far more interesting alternatives that can become part of our sound. And I think that is one of the most interesting things about doing all of this stuff that we do.